Good afternoon, everybody. I see we have friends just dialing in now, so we'll just give it a minute as everyone joins our webinar, and then we'll get started. Pat, let me know when you're connected to audio. Still nothing on you. And if you're just joining us, welcome. We see participants still coming in now. We'll get started in just a few seconds.
Hey, Laura, I'll monitor the chat as well. But one of the things I would love to do is ask our attendees, what was it about this webinar they were looking to learn? This is a different topic, and I'm just curious to see if folks listening wanted to tell us why this topic. What was interesting about this to you?
Yep, so if the participants who can hear us, if you can use your chat room and let us know what appealed to you about this particular topic. Yeah. And also that you're on and who you're with, and we'd love to say hello. And Pat, any audio on you? Might want to try to dial in by phone, or at least chat to us that you can hear us, because we cannot hear you.
We may want to send, I forget how to do it. Can you send Pat just the dial in? I forget how to do it on this one here.
Well, the dial in should have been on his confirmation email.
I got it here, just a second here.
And it might be unique to him, but that's okay. Then he'll just dial in as two Toms.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and get started since we have a good 5 or 10 minutes before Pat comes on anyway. So I'd like to welcome everybody to the All Hazards Consortium Business Resiliency Virtual Discussion Series. This is about our 20th or so webinar that we've done since COVID started. And this one particular focuses on Endeavor, which is a model for state and local disaster resilience. I didn't know what Endeavor was until we started putting this together. So I'm excited to hear more about it and also share with you what I've learned. But for those of you who haven't met me yet, I'm Laura Johnson. I'm the Director of Conferences and Events for the All Hazards Consortium. Just a couple administrative remarks before we get started. You've all been dialed on as mute, so you can hear us, but we can't hear you. But you can use your chat room as well as the question area in your dashboard to send us comments or ask questions, and we recommend you do so throughout the next 60 minutes of discussion that we'll have with the panelists, and we will reserve time at the very end, another 30 minutes for time to address those questions, as well as if we have time at the very end, unmute all of you and get to see your faces, and you'll get a chance to say hello audibly. So we are recording today's webinar, and we will send that to you post-event. So if you need to drop off early or want to share this discussion with any of your colleagues or peers, that'll be sent directly to you. And now I'd just like to introduce my Executive Director, Tom Moran. Tom.
Hey, Laura, thank you. Welcome, everybody. Laura mentioned, I just want to mention again, what was it about this topic that interested you? And let me tell you why that's important. Working together, public and private, is hard. It's hard to start. It's hard to maintain. I know hundreds of organizations that started when we did in 2005 aren't around anymore. It's really difficult. So sustaining these things are difficult. It's hard for government. It's hard for industry. But I think today you're going to hear about a model that was really a joint venture, if you will, that brought private sector and public sector together in the state of Pennsylvania in a unique way. We're going to have Jeff Thomas and Molly talk about how that worked, how it came together, how it established its own governance system. So that's why I'm really excited about this, because the whole goal here is to sustain beyond elections, sustain beyond that. So today you might hear reference to the SISE, the SISE, the Sensitive Information Sharing Framework. This is a legal framework established by the private sector in 2015 so they could share and protect information and identities with operational information during key disasters. And it provides this trust framework to have honest to goodness, frank conversations without fear of media or non-operational people being involved. But it also created a very interesting way to protect information from FOIA and frivolous information requests that's many times destroy trust. So it's been very successful. And you might hear that. You can sign up or register with that at no cost at siceusa.org. And there's a ton of information on there to help you understand what it is, how it works, how it benefits you. So with that, I just welcome all of you to the call today, and anxious to get into it. So go ahead, Laura.
All right, thank you, Tom. I'd like to welcome today's panelist. Back with us is Molly Doherty, who is the External Affairs and Private Sector Liaison with Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency. We have Katie Murphy, who's the Senior Manager of Business Continuity with CNS Wholesale Grocers. Pat Shull, the Director of Safety, Security, and Risk Assessment with the Harrisburg Property Services, and Jeff Thomas, Executive Deputy Director of the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency. So welcome to all of you. We have a set of, I think, 5 questions today that we're going to ask our panelists. The first one is, what is Endeavor, and what challenges did you have that created the need for this model? How did it change the way that you integrated with your partners? And I'm going to start off with Jeff. And Jeff, if you could start by introducing yourself and then move into question number 1.
Well, Laura, thank you. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining Tom and the All Hazards Consortium. So I am the Executive Deputy Director of the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency. That kind of means that I'm the number 2, and I do whatever you need to do to keep the agency moving forward. And one of the things that a lot of folks in my position or positions like mine, for whatever reasons, but it's pretty common, we tend to recycle. So most of us, when you get to, there's a great thing of getting to a level of a policymaker in an organization is you really get to affect change, things that as you have come up in your career, you realize, boy, I think, you know, for everything I've learned, it would be a little better if we could do this a little differently, maybe a little better, and you can actually affect those changes. The bad part of that is when you get to that level, any new governor has the absolute responsibility to bring with him or her people that share their exact same policies and principles. That's why they were elected, why he or she was elected. And what happens when that happens is they normally come in with people that they've already identified that share that same policy ideas that they have. So that's why some folks recycle. So I was one of those folks that recycled. I retired in 2010 or 11 after quite a long career in state government. And the last number of years, probably 8, 9, 10 years, was in emergency management. One of the things that we struggled hard to do, us and other states, was to really get a good private-public partnership going. That was kind of new back in 2006 and 7. Public-private partnerships were not as well known as they are today. And so what happens with not just us, but of course, you know, there's an association. We talk to emergency management directors across the U.S. is that we found that as we developed these programs and you had someone in your organization that was part of the program, it really took off for a while. And then as that person either got promoted, left, cycled out, the program went away. And we would start and stop and start and stop. And I said, you know, this is just not working. So one of the organizations that I had been involved with for a long time at different parts of my career is a Fleet Response Working Group. Now that's an organization that also works with All Hazards. That is the group of states and industry partners, primarily are all electric sector partners. Electric sector has phenomenal mutual aid already built in, but what they were having trouble doing is moving their crews across states because crews come from far away. Obviously, you want crews out of the disaster to be able to come in and to assist the crews that are working in the disaster. And for years, we had trouble moving them across state lines, with tolling on turnpikes, moving them in and out of the country, quite frankly, because we bring down teams in my area from Canada. And this all hazards worked with the Fleet Response Working Group to be able to create this group of public-private partnership. And we met on a fairly regular basis, and we worked through some of what you would think would be the most complex things, but when you got at the level where you had policymakers and on both business and government involved, a lot of that strips away and it becomes just common sense. And we were able to work that for quite a long time, and we've made a lot of strides. One of the things I noticed about that wasn't government driven. That was really private sector driven. So that was driven through All Hazards and through Edison Electronic Institute. I probably have that wrong, but I think that's it. And government was a big part of it, but it wasn't dependent on government. So I go away for 4 years. We're very involved in All Hazards. I come back. Tom knows I'm back. He gives me a call. He says, we catch up. He says, yeah, we haven't heard from Pima in 4 years. But you know what? The Fleet Response Working Group was still working. The Fleet Response Working Group was still there. And everything that made it work was still there. Pennsylvania was a little bit of a participant in those 4 years, but not the same as they were before. So as this governor was very interested in public-private partnerships, as most of them are, and the challenge was, how are we going to do this better? Because we hadn't done a lot. And the Fleet Response Working Group kind of came to mind. And so we come up with a plan. And for this to work, people like me needed to be very honest. So we got together, we talked to some of the most, I wouldn't say influential businesses, but we talked with our community development folks about what are the most important businesses to Pennsylvania that if they went away, we would be in the most economic trouble. And we invited, I want to say 40 or 50 folks. We talked to All Hazards and asked them if they would help us with this. And we actually kicked this off because the governor is involved in this at the governor's residence, which kind of send the message that Pennsylvania is serious about this. The governor is supporting this. And we started kind of this off with this conversation, this very frank, open conversation that I'm having with you now, that policymakers in government, people that can really affect change, are temporary. And we have to recognize that. And we have to realize that the policies we put in place and the procedures we put in place can't be people dependent. It has to be business dependent. And the only way you're going to do that is you're going to have to get business to really step up and lead this with government at the table. So as opposed to run by government, it is government at the table. And I think that you'll find when you listen to the Endeavor Group, and that's how Endeavor was born. And Pat was phenomenal at stepping up and being the first lead for that. Molly will describe this as we threw a birthday party and says, by the way, we're going to have it at your house. So that is really how it started. So it isn't Molly dependent. It isn't Jeff dependent. Jeff will move on probably at the end of this administration. Molly, may hit the lottery and move on. So they are the kind of things that we really paid attention to. And Endeavor has really has grown tremendously. And I am absolutely confident that no matter who the next governor of Pennsylvania is, that Endeavor is going to be here. And with that much strength of business, government has no choice but to come to the table. So that's the model. It's a little different. So I hope I haven't talked too much.
All right, Jeff, thank you so much. I'm going to ask Molly the same question. What challenges were you facing that felt the need for this? Anything you want to add to that, Molly?
Well, first, I'd like to add that I'm winning the lottery and not getting hit by a bus. I'm always challenged by the examples we use of what might happen, but the success of Endeavor and how we've structured it is, Executive Deputy Thomas is exactly right. It's based on the willingness for the private sector to participate. And we really wouldn't have this model as successful as it was if it wasn't for the leadership from Katie and Pat, and then most certainly, our governor, our director, Padfield, and Deputy Director Thomas. I think the challenge at an operational level, and how we'll talk more about the model, but really the challenge we have is there are at least 30 programs that we know of, that 30 states that have some kind of a private sector engagement. I think only one of them that we know of has a full-time. And how do you have a program that engages private sector when, frankly, we don't have a full-time person, but we have a full-time commitment? And so setting up this model and having the challenges in how to stay relevant is you have the other half of the partner drive what we talk about. And that's what we mean by private sector private sector led with government at the table, is that we will support the discussions and the solutions in any way we can. And the success comes from our partners saying, okay, we want to tackle this. We want to tackle this. And having that open, frank conversation to build those solutions. And that's how we've built that trusted partnership. So really our greatest challenge is, how do you have a full-time commitment when you don't always have full-time people? And you do that by building that relationship and the private sector buying in and putting in the work to say, this is what will keep us coming back.
Okay, thank you, Molly. Katie, hi, why don't you take a minute to introduce yourself and tell us how Endeavor came across your desk?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Katie Murphy. I'm with CNS Wholesale Grocers. So we have operations all throughout the United States, from Hawaii to Texas, all the way up to New England. We service a lot of your mom and pop independent stores that you're familiar with, along with Target, Stop and Shop, Giant. So, major chains that people shop at. And we have distribution centers all across Pennsylvania, from York, Robesonia, to Du Bois, to Bethlehem. So we have quite a big footprint in the area. So I came across Endeavor by working with Carmela Hinderaker, who's also at CNS Wholesale Grocers. And she's had a long relationship with Molly. And I think, we've really leveraged Molly and the group to help ground truth things that we hear, whether it's, during hurricanes or during coronavirus. I think, the one thing that we've seen is that a lot of times our operators have questions and they need immediate answers. And when there's a lot of things flying around there, being able to have one person who is one phone call away from having the information is really valuable. When Molly just mentioned that there's only very few full-time people who do this across the US, to me, that's always very surprising. So I think, it's, we operate based on the information that we have, right? And it's only as good as information that we have. So one example that I'll give is, during the recent storms that we had last year for winter weather, just knowing which roads were being closed and getting updated situational awareness on that, not only for Pennsylvania, but for other neighboring states, that is really valuable for us to be able to operate, to continue to serve our customers. So, I think, Molly has been very responsive, and Pennsylvania has been very responsive with what our information needs are. So, not only do I let her know what I need at the moment, but things that I'm concerned about a week from now or 2 weeks from now, especially as coronavirus was going on, she really kept it on her radar, and she was really good about, I think, coming back to us when she found resources. Maybe she didn't have information at the time, but she had a pulse out there of what our concerns were. So I think, for us to develop that relationship ahead of time, so she knew what our capabilities are, but also some of what our big concerns are, is really helpful. Because, she's able to triage that information and really bring it up and elevate it as needed. So she's a really great partner. So thank you.
Thanks, Katie. We also have with us Patrick Schull. Pat, if you want to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about how you were introduced to Endeavor. Had a little audio trouble before, so.
Hey, Laura, let me make a comment while we're waiting for Pat. I think one of the other things that states many times need help with is, all of us have been in meetings where you have public and private come together for some reason, and then you come down to the next step, right? We talk about a problem, we talk about this, and how do you move to the next step? Well, that requires action. requires a decision and a commitment to take on something. And this is hard for government. When we did our kickoff meeting at the governor's mansion, it was May 2018. And that was a very scripted meeting because in the private sector, we know private sector wouldn't be there if they weren't interested in solving problems, right? But as I said to Jeff and Molly, I said, when you guys are done at the end of the meeting, we are going to close for a commitment from both of you, right? And so I brought in John Shaner, who was the chair of the Fleet Work Group, and John knew right there that private sector needs to know three things. One, what is it? How am I going to benefit? Okay. What is the operational benefit are we going to get if we do this? And then what do you need from me? Okay. And it's that last question I think government, we all struggle with, is asking somebody for something. Molly and I joke about this all the time because many times the state can't say, hey, will you support this? Well, we could, right? The private sector could. So when it got to that part of the meeting, government stepped to the back of the room and private sector took over and got private sector to commit. Say, here's our work plan, here's what we're going to do, and we need a chair and a co-chair right there at the kickoff meeting. And so who's going to be chair? I asked the question of the group, and the group was looking around, and Pat Scholl was sitting in the back of the room, and Pat's a leader, if you know him. I mean, he said, well, I guess I'll step up and volunteer. I said, I have no idea what I'm committing to, but this sounds like something really important. And then Carmela, Katie's boss, I guess, was sitting in the back of the room, and I knew Carmela was there. And Carmela gets this, right? And I said, Carmela, would you give it a shot as vice chair? Yeah. So we're going to do one call. Here's our next step. And so it was scripted out. And what the private sector did was take it over and facilitate it. So it wasn't on the back of Molly and Jeff to do that. That's really an awkward position to put government in. And I think private sector, safe to say, can move quicker sometimes, but they need state EOC connection to know what's real, what's out of bounds, what's in bounds. We started many use cases that just were never going to happen. We just scrapped them. The state didn't have to sit. That's where the model kind of facilitates this. And I think that's what really made it unique, was that the private sector was able to support that and take on that ownership role. So it wasn't left to the state. Because the state can do some things very well, and there's other things that are just awkward, or it's just not legal or comfortable, and all this stuff like that. So Pat was really good, and I hope, Pat, your audio gets squared away, because Pat can tell this story really well. But it's all how it starts. And the last thing I'll say is Endeavor started with one purpose, is to solve operational problems for the private sector. Right? That was the number one purpose. And we came out of that first meeting with 3 areas: transportation, information. We had an empty trailer policy. Molly will talk about in just a minute. That was a killer, in Pennsylvania. You deliver it, you get empty truck, you're grounded until the snow's gone or whatever. So, and then there was a third one like that. And so we got very specific, but Jeff and Molly started with, let's see what problems we can solve for you, private sector. So right away, private sector was like, wow, that sounds different. And they did it. And we followed up and kept moving. So anyway.
Yeah. So unfortunately, Tom, it looks like I can't get audio on Pat.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next question. Tom, if you have a background option or number, you can try one more time with Pat. We'll try to get him on for the next question.
Okay.
But let's move on to our second question. So Molly, I'll start with you on this one. What issues did Endeavor address for you once it was up and running, and what problems did it solve? Oh, you're on mute, Molly.
All right. Well, you missed the really good part. No, the way we structured Endeavor is really to engage when there is not an event. As we have an expression in emergency management, when the disasters happened. That's not when you want to be exchanging the business cards. And we have events in Pennsylvania all the time that will affect business operations, and then the end result being our communities being able to get the resources they need. But we don't have wholesale statewide major events regularly. So we get flooding, and we will have flooding during hurricane season, but we're not Texas in 2020 right now. And so we really rely on the blue sky time when there are no events to build that trusted relationship. And so there have been a number of issues that we've been able to work through. And what it has done is allowed us to build that trusted relationship. So we had, I'll give you an example of, we had a number of utilities through, when they have events during, like they'll have their RMAG, which is how they, it's kind of like a mutual assistance among other utilities. They'll bring in crews from Canada. And we had an instance where we didn't have a disaster in Pennsylvania. In order for Canadian crews to cross the border to come to Pennsylvania, we had a need. We didn't have a declaration. They were required to produce a paper declaration for Border Patrol. And that one didn't exist, nor did we have a process for how to deal with that. And so in working through that, when that originally happened, it took 12 hours to kind of work through that. But in being able to work through in a blue sky time, what is the process? Who has authorities? It allows us to better understand the needs of the utilities. It allows the federal government to better understand the needs of the state as well as the utilities. And then it also, most importantly, allows us to connect private sector, in this case utilities, with a number of agencies at the state level to build that relationship, which is, we call it's a relationship by choice. We are not regulators. We don't work with lobbyists. It's really building relationships through solving operational challenges. The result of that was that we were able to reduce the process down to, I think the second time that happened after we built the process, I think it was about 20 minutes. The more important thing that did for us, though, was because we had that relationship, we have a number of utilities who knew who to call to be able to ask for information, or to be able to say, we understand there's a storm coming, we want to be able to pre-stage. I'd like to talk with PennDOT about using the park and ride lots. Because they've already had that working relationship, they're in a far better position to be able to quickly find those solutions. And Katie brought up a fantastic example. Our greatest challenge is being able to ground truth and be able to know what the environment is and what's the anticipated environment. We have a vested interest in making sure commerce continues and businesses get back to business quickly, because when the businesses are open, the communities are able to use those businesses for resources. And then we're not in a position of trying to provide those resources and what we call fixing a problem with a 200-mile screwdriver. So during the past couple of years and working with, let's say, C&S wholesalers on a number of different issues, it became a very natural conversation when the pandemic hit, and we were talking about the different restrictions that we can expect to happen. Katie's response to what was happening for them in terms of food distribution was gold for us in better understanding kind of that situation, the situational awareness. She was able to say, expect shortages on this type of food. What are you going to be doing about creative daycare solutions? We're going to have employees that aren't going to be able to come to work. That was absolute gold in the emergency management world, because then we know what to plan for. Our priorities are going to be making sure people are fed, make sure people are, their health and safety, and shelter and food is a priority. Also making sure those businesses that provide the shelter and food are able to continue. So those engagements in solutions really provides a very valuable solution during an activation, which is information and us knowing what to plan for, and we can't get that without being able to have that trusted relationship with CNS, where she knows she can share something and it's not going to be taken in a regulatory manner. It's not going to be taken in a lobbying or a sales manner. It's going to be taken in the nature of what in which it's being provided, which is, you need to know this because we're about to deal with this. And so that's been particularly important. I'll share a story. It's really my favorite story. The follow-up meeting to the meeting in the governor's residence, we had a number of participants from that meeting that came to the second one, and that's really where the rubber met the road. This is where we figured out what were the challenges going to be, and who was going to work on what, and how do we work as a group of private sector and public sector together. And we had we had leaders from PennDOT as well as our Pennsylvania Turnpike. And they were talking about certain ways that the decisions for restrictions and speed restrictions and when we would have an empty tractor trailer. And it was a really straightforward explanation of how PennDOT and the Turnpike factor in different elements for restrictions. And we had one of our partners say, that's the first time I've ever understood how that happens. And it makes so much sense. And that was the perfect open door to be able to work through, what does even an empty tractor trailer mean? And so how that benefits the government side is that when PennDOT and the Turnpike are trying to communicate restrictions and they want folks to follow them, they're able to work with folks in the endeavor to be able to say, this is what empty means. And then the private sector says, great, I'll follow it if I know what that means. So that's been just a tremendous value for us in emergency management, and being able to say, we have these restrictions, this is why, and private sector is able to follow it because they understand what it is and they know what it is. So we've come to a far better understanding of the world that we're working in and the challenges we're working in. And private sector, we're better able to understand kind of their challenges. And it's probably the most valuable relationship I've had in a working environment in my experience.
Thank you so much, Molly. That was great. Jeff, did you want to add anything as far as your use of Endeavor?
I think Molly covered it very well. I think one of the things that and maybe we'll get to this later, that has really made this work has been setting the ground rules from the beginning. I mean, we were very clear with Endeavor and with our partners that we'll do our best to explain to you why we do things the way we do them in government. And I think that's been extremely helpful. And it would help us to understand how, as we're getting ready to make policy decisions, how that affects you. And knowing that in advance of doing it is just the key to all of this. Because otherwise, we've all been down this road. You know, we think we're making the best decisions. We have missed part of the input. We make the decision, and then it is not quite as cordial a relationship to get back to where we would have ended up in the first place had we talked to folks in the beginning. So that is not what we want to do. And that I mean, you see Tom laughing, but that we've all been there. That's how this works. Hopefully, we have gotten smarter and realized. And I think, you know, not to get off subject, but I think if you have been part of some of the discussions, listen, some of the most contentious issues is we put for years, and I'll go off on a tangent. I'm going to try to keep this pointed. For years, we have struggled with, in Pennsylvania, not doing the best job in the world of when we would have accidents, of keeping people from being stuck on the roads. We have had people die because we couldn't get medical resources to them. We have had children born because they were happened to be stuck on the road during the winter. That's where their children were born. And based on the fact that we've had folks run out of fuel and be stuck there for 8 and 10 hours, we could have had kids conceived, who knows? But the issue is that it is a safety issue. And when we, and I understand, and I've actually sent Tom some information that was done by Texas A&M years ago. I know what it costs when we stop commerce on our roads, and I am very tuned into that. I've done business for a long time. So trying to find that middle ground was hard for us. But without Endeavor, without all of the parties being able to speak and talk to each other in an open, honest forum, I don't think we'd ever get where we were. Not everyone got what they wanted, but everybody got to a point where, hey, consensus is that everyone, had their say and they can live with the answer. Not that you got everything you wanted. And that was one of the toughest things for us to work through, and it was contentious. But it got less and less contentious the more time we had to be able to bring the private sector partners in and have the discussion with them in advance. And sometimes they didn't like the policies we put in place, but they understood them. And understanding them made all the difference in the world in being able to live with them because they knew why they were put in place.
And Jeff, how many partners are part of that model for you?
It depends. I mean, it is Endeavor and Molly do a really good job of expanding and bringing. I mean, we are open to anybody, but when on the state side. But so it's one of the things that I think is important. What we bring to the table, we bring not just PEMA. We will bring the Turnpike Commission, the state police, the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation. And when we come to the table to talk with the private sector, we bring decision makers. We bring folks that are actually can affect policy, because otherwise, when you get too many layers, you end up really just having meetings for the sake of having meetings. And that's one thing we said we don't want to do.
All right, Jeff, very important. Thank you so much. So we're going to switch over to the private sector panelists now. Pat, do we have audio on you?
How about now?
Woohoo! Yes. All right, Pat, sorry about that. If you could take a minute to introduce yourself and then let us know your experience with Endeavor and how it changed the way you may have communicated, prioritized, or worked with your government and your industry partners.
I'd like to first thank everyone for attending and also for my fellow panelists. Let me just give you a quick background. Shortly after I retired from the Air Force, a little over 20 years ago, I took this position, and we had a bomb threat at the federal building, which is half a block away, and it had a significant impact on our business operation. We owned a Hilton Hotel, and that lack of communication between government and the private sector probably in the long run cost us anywhere from $75,000 to $100,000 in lost business revenue. And I knew that the only way it would work is if we can develop a relationship with the emergency responders, with the public sector, and develop that, just as Molly mentioned, that relationship is critical. So when I was invited to the governor's house to hear about what the state wanted to do, PEMA wanted to do, it just really married up with what we called our downtown working group. The most important part of this is you're getting real-time, vetted, valid communication from the public sector, and how then the private sector can react accordingly and also share their capabilities and resources, and we turn into a partnership and not a dictatorship. And that's really critical, because everyone knows when you, in an operation, you get the ball rolling, and if the state or federal government says, stop here, you can't go any further, but we're part of helping out in the problem, we're not the problem, then it has worked. And Endeavor has done that. As mentioned earlier, with snowstorms, with all sorts of hazards type situation, the building of those relationships where we're exchanging real-time vetted information so we can all make critical decisions has been invaluable, and it has proven itself time and time again. And I'm grateful for what Jeff said about let's throw the politics out of it. Who's governor, who's not, doesn't matter. Let's work public-private sector relationship and move forward. And both Jeff and Molly has given me a lot more credit than I deserve as a chair, because I'm more of a participant than I am a chair. Tom and Molly and Jeff have made a real big difference in this Endeavor group, and I'm very grateful for the three of them because it has expanded contacts and resources. Quick example, I got over 1,000 masks in for free through a contact Molly had through Homeland Security for employees. That's going to last us for a long time. So that's just a small example. So vetted, critical, timely information is what Endeavor is all about. No dilly, no dally. Let's get to it. Let's work it. What we can, we can. What we can't, we'll work on it later, and let's move forward. And so far, so good.
All right, Pat, thank you so much. Can you tell us just a few words about your company?
Yes, the company I work for is Harristown Enterprises, and I work for a subordinate company where I'm the Director of Safety, Security, and Risk. We're in downtown Harrisburg, where our mission started back in 1974 after the Agnes flood, where we were to develop and redevelop and expand and grow and revitalize downtown Harrisburg. And once again, there was a natural disaster where private public sector came together back in the early 70s to work towards revitalizing downtown Harrisburg, and it's worked well. So we deal with a lot of challenging situations where we have to interact with the public sector every day, and we have to make decisions that impact our workforce. So once again, being connected with Endeavor and the other groups through Tom has paid off most valuably.
Thank you so much. Katie, we're going to go ahead and move to you. How did Endeavor, once it was up and running, change the way you worked with your partners, whether it be government or industry?
Yeah, sure. So I'll take it from more a blue sky approach. So last year, Carmel and I, we attended a summit. I believe it was in Hershey, pre-pandemic. And we were really able to learn a lot from our private sector partners that we probably wouldn't have normally engaged with. So I think, just in general, better understanding the landscape that's specific to Pennsylvania, then also understanding the concerns that those private sector partners had. I remember us doing an exercise, and we were sitting with a lot of people from the financial service industry, telecommunications, and I think also the dairy industry, which is huge in Pennsylvania. But I think, especially because we are in the food sector, hearing them talk about their challenges helped me as a business continuity and an emergency management professional think about those cascading impacts in ways that I probably wouldn't have thought of in, just during my day-to-day work. So I think for me, that was really enlightening to better understand first how Pennsylvania is structured, where every state has its nuances. And I think to better understand that is really helpful for me because we monitor every single state basically, except for the middle of the US. And then secondly, really understand the industries that are important in Pennsylvania and some of the challenges that they might have, specifically as it comes to like utilities and fuel and things like that, because that at the end of the day will impact us. How we're able to recover and respond also. So I think that's been very, very beneficial for me.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Katie. We're going to move on to our next question, which deals with the vision. And we'll start with the states. What is your definition of success as it relates to working with the private sector moving forward? And Jeff, if I can start with you on this question.
Well, I think the definition of success as it relates to work in private sector, I think I kind of explained that. To me, the definition of success was that we actually got in a room and worked through problems and worked use cases instead of either being contentious with each other or trying to use either legislative methods or public. The fact that we were able to convince the private sector that, yeah, we're really not monsters. I mean, we really will talk to you. To me, that was success, was we need to listen to you. And also, I think trying, as Pat just talked about, gaining the confidence of the private sector that we really were looking to solve operational problems. This is this whole Endeavor work group and PEMA's approach to, actually the Commonwealth's approach to public-private partnership in this in this emergency place is all about solving operational problems and creating efficiencies in operations. And I think that the fact that it is expanding, that there are more businesses getting involved, I think that really is part of how I would say that we are beginning to see. I think Molly and Patrick can talk about individual successes. And I think the fact that we're having individual successes, to me, is the definition of it's working the way I want it to work. It is solving operational problems that benefit everybody. The better businesses do in Pennsylvania, the better the Commonwealth is. And that is our job. I mean, we work for the Commonwealth. So that, to me, really is the definition of success.
All right, Jeff, thank you so much. Molly, anything to add, especially as you're growing Endeavor?
I think Jeff summarized it really well. It's, success is that we're staying relevant. The relationship is still producing a value for both state government as well as our partners. I think our definition of success also includes, our partners feel that they know that they have the freedom to bring up challenges, and that's from multiple sectors. Our greatest value, I think, will be it's not just a business to government relationship, but we're also able to encourage, what Katie described is that also the business to business opportunities where we really build a strong network, but it's all towards the common goal, which is having a far more resilient community, regardless of the disaster, whether it's natural or, a pandemic.
Okay, Molly, thank you so much. Katie, you already talked about how Endeavor has helped, especially during Blue Sky Days. How do you see this model maturing for you? How else can it be helpful for you?
Yeah, we've still been in coronavirus for such a long time, so it's hard to think about. I think when we met, we've been focused a lot on winter weather and fuel, and now with coronavirus. I think, my approach as an emergency manager when I was with the City of New York was very much an all hazards approach. So, what are strategies that we can take that are applicable in a lot of different types of disasters? I think that, Tom and Molly, that would be an interesting thing to think about. It is, really looking at things that are commonalities across different types of disasters so that we could really think about the strategies that not only work in a hurricane event, but maybe a public health event and those types of things. So I know that you guys did start calls with the private sector also, during coronavirus. So I think that was a great model in terms of sharing situational awareness and really keeping your pulse on what was going on throughout the state. So, really leveraging that moving forward, I think would be a great asset to the whole business community. So.
All right, Katie, thank you so much. So Pat, I'm actually going to jump ahead to the next question here about case studies, because I think we covered question number 3 pretty well. Do you have any examples of how you can demonstrate the value of Endeavor to the listeners on the line today?
Well, I think there's 2 that come to mind. Pre-COVID, I recall a lot of the industries that relied on transportation and logistics, the trucking industry. And Molly was able to, and it dealt with road restrictions during inclement weather. And Molly was able to bring in the commander of the patrol division of the Pennsylvania State Police. And you're talking to the real cat who is in charge out there and understands this is what the restrictions are, this is how we enforce it, how can we help you and still keep Pennsylvania roadways safe? And that made such a world of difference where the state said we can do this, but we can't do that. Jeff and Molly facilitated that, and that was a use case with, as I think Tom mentioned it earlier, about road restrictions, and it has made a difference. And I think that vetted information and that partnership said, okay, that makes sense to me. We can plan accordingly if you're going to do this, and if you can work with us on this will be great. So that's one. The other one is with COVID is, believe it or not, there's been rumors out there about COVID. I don't know if you can believe that or not, but there are. And social media is just running amok. One thing that Endeavor has done is be able to, with the use cases, is to find out what information do you need. Not we're going to tell you what you need, but what information can PEMA and the other departments within Pennsylvania, what do you need from them to help you to conduct operations under COVID? It kept employees here in my place of business gainfully employed. We were able to do things that we were not in violation of and keep people working and meet our customer needs also and keep the revenue flowing. And it's all because of the relationship we had in Endeavor, because we presented to them use cases kind of as an ad hoc, and they said, okay, let us dig in, let us find out, and we'll get back to you. So those are the two that I would point out, is one pre-COVID and now during COVID.
All right, great examples. Thank you so much, Pat. Molly, how about you? I know you talked a little bit about the value of Endeavor before. Is there any particular case study you want to share with us? Another case study?
Yeah, and actually it's to build on what Jeff talked about, which is, you know, as the private sector liaison for the program, what that means is I'm a connector. I'm a connector of people, organizations, solutions to challenges that are brought up. And it's a terrific position to be in, because I can hear any number of issues that someone brings up, and that can trigger a solution from another conversation that I've had. And so really an interesting example is the challenge that we've had with transportation and waivers. And when does the state have a waiver for, you know, if we have inclement weather and there's a waiver for hours of service? When does Pennsylvania do that? And when does the federal motor carriers? And, you know, with multiple layers of government, from federal to state to county to local, that can be a real challenge to really understand what the regulation is. And we had a number of our partners that were asking for, you know, when does this waiver apply to us and when doesn't it? And I don't have the answer to that, and I don't know that I ever should have the answer to that. What I have is access to the different agencies and decision makers that have that information. So we were actually able to bring together a number of our private sector partners that weren't necessarily in transportation. They just happened to be heavily reliant on transportation, like C&S Wholesale Grocers, for example, to bring them together along with our state transportation partners, our state police, and federal motor carriers. And we worked through, when does this waiver apply? And by the way, when you, federal motor carriers, when you do regional waivers, that's tremendously helpful. Well, we had folks from federal motor carriers that make those decisions on a regional level, and we're able to hear directly from the private sector partners in Pennsylvania and could take that back, and so that they're far more likely to have a regional waiver. And then PennDOT and state police are in a far better position to know what's to be enforced, what's not, and keeps our roads moving, keeps our businesses operating much quicker. So that's kind of a use case where it came out of something not directly related. I don't think there was ever a time that someone raised their hand and said, by the way, I would really like to work through this waiver issue. It came up because there were enough of our partners that were asking, and then there were enough of our agencies that were saying we're not totally clear. So we were able to bring everyone to the table and work through. Federal motor carriers will have a waiver, and they're going to change some of the language that PennDOT and the Turnpike were able to say, when you phrase it this way, it's unclear if we also have to have a waiver or if we can use the regional waiver. And they said, oh, that's great. And they changed the language. So that work that was done during the blue sky was particularly invaluable when we had snow that following that discussion, because when it's snowing and we're having to impose restrictions, that's not the time to be figuring out what the language actually means. So that was that being the connector, let's say, or the liaison, really is what brought tremendous value to being able to work through those issues. And it was a multi-layered issue in terms of jurisdiction. It was federal, state, local, private sector, and multiple state agencies.
Molly, thank you for that.
Sure.
And Katie, we're going to move to you for the food sector perspective. Do you have a case study that you can share with us?
Yeah, I mean, Molly has been talking a lot about the waivers for transportation. I think, that's something that we are always looking at. And I think it was especially helpful and really, in our previous discussions, we talked a lot about the triggers of what would necessitate certain waivers and, the clear definitions of what these waivers mean. So, you guys have both talked about it a lot, so I won't elaborate on it too much, but I think just that pre-planning and really understanding and being on the same page of how it's actually going to be operationalized has helped us to better plan on our side too, and give us instruction to our warehouses what to look for and the things that they might have to work through. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you. And Jeff, anything you want to add to this slide?
No, I really think that they covered the case studies very, very well. Thank you.
All right, Jeff. Okay, so let's move on to our fifth and last question. And with this one, I'm going to start with you, Jeff. Are there any recommendations that you can provide to others to improve their resiliency efforts? We have about 50 or so listeners on the line. So what would be your one bit of advice to them?
So I think that what we talk about a lot, in order to be resilient, you need to know what your hazards are. And we talk about this a lot with homeowners, but I think it also goes for businesses. We have talked to many Pennsylvania businesses as well as Pennsylvania homeowners. And this is a story that Molly's heard me say before, because we try to be data driven. And sometimes when you look at the data, you really get surprised. So businesses or homeowners, we talk about if you live in a flood area, you need to be, you need to understand your potential for flooding. Which for 50 years we have talked to folks about. Live by the river, you live in a flood area, you should have flood insurance. The NFIP did a phenomenal job at that. Great job of 50 years telling people to do that. The problem that happened is that things changed, and I'm not going to get into a discussion about climate change. Does it exist? Does it not? Does it not exist? That's not a discussion for me to have. I can tell you that over the last 50 years, in heavy rain events, so that's more of 2 inches of rain in less than 2 hours, in northeastern United States, not Pennsylvania, United States, there's been a 74% increase in heavy rain events over the last 50 years. You pick your science of why it happened. It doesn't matter to me. What does matter to me is that in that same period of time, we didn't change our message. So we have more and more people that are and businesses that are really being hit hard, and flooding is a main threat in Pennsylvania. That's why I'm talking about that, but it really works for anything. Being hit hard and really suffering losses that may not have the adequate insurance coverages. And one of the reasons is because, there's two sides to everything. If we're telling everybody that lives in a flood zone they need flood insurance, the obviously conclusion is, well, if I don't live there, I don't need it. So that is the problem. We did a survey. We went back to 1993, looked at every flooding event in Pennsylvania. And I was surprised to find out that 94% of them happened outside of the flood hazard areas. So they're the people that are being flooded. So what I would tell you is, with any resiliency program, The first thing you need to know are what are your risks, and spend some time, spend some energy in figuring out what your risks actually are, so that you're really protecting yourself against every one of them, not just a few of them. So you can translate that to the business you're in. You can take a hard look at that. And changing narratives takes a long time. So get out ahead of that, pay attention to that, find out what your risks really are. If you're a business, talk to your state or your local emergency management community. They will help you. They do hazard risk identification. Every state does it. Every county does it. You just need to connect with them. And like Molly says, it's a great time to connect with them when the sun's out and you're not in the middle of a disaster. And ask them that question. Hey, what risks do you see in the area where my business is? What natural risks, that's what I'm talking about, our natural risks. What natural risks do you see? But start that conversation, pay attention to it. I think it will pay you dividends in making sure that you're doing everything you can do to be as resilient as you can be.
That's great advice. Thank you so much. And Molly, what would be your one piece of advice for the listeners today?
Well, I think, you know, the Endeavor program, although we work at a state level, you know, we have 67 counties and 2,500 municipalities in Pennsylvania, and every event starts local. So I reiterate really what our Executive Deputy Thomas says, which is start where your community is. And so if you're a business and you have locations in specific counties, contact those county coordinators. There are businesses that have multiple locations and it can be a challenge. Example like Walmart, where, you know, we have a couple thousand Walmarts located throughout the state. But Walmart does a terrific job at training their managers on the store managers on, you need to contact the county emergency manager and you need to have this conversation. And that's so tremendously helpful because we've had an example with a tornado in Northeast Pennsylvania in Wilkes-Barre. And Lowe's does the same thing where they train their store managers to contact the county emergency management coordinator before something happens and establish that relationship. And what that resulted in was when the tornado hit, it hit two malls. Fortunately, it did not hit at a time when there were people there. It was after hours, but it destroyed a number of stores, including Lowe's being affected. Well, because they had that relationship, the store manager at Lowe's knew to contact the emergency management coordinator in that county. The county already knew who they were, and they were able to work out when Lowe's would be able to reopen to be able to provide supplies to the other stores so that they could board up for security reasons. And they were able to open up to just the stores and not publicly to the, you know, the general public, but just publicly to, or just to the stores in those two affected areas. And then they were also able to contact us to let us know what efforts are happening. And then there was the relationship with how Lowe's is able to support the local community. But then also importantly is the local emergency managers knew what security they needed to provide to those different stores because of the different stock challenges, hours, anything that they have. They're able to work through those issues so that there's already that established relationship. And folks, there was actually, social media, there were rumors of diamonds being strewn about the parking lot. And that store owner having a conversation with the police and the emergency management agencies that were responding to that mall, that's not the time to have that first conversation to explain who they are. Since they had already done that, they were able to explain, look, my insurance company is requiring that they get in here. When can we get in here? And because they had established that relationship ahead of time, they're not having to try to convince a bunch of different public safety, emergency management, all at different levels how they can get access to that store. So I would encourage, whether you have multiple locations or whether you have one or two locations, make contact with that local emergency manager. It's as important, frankly, and in many cases it could be more important than your relationship at the state level, because there are a number of events that will happen locally that don't escalate to the state involvement. So that would be really my primary recommendation.
Perfect, Molly. Thank you so much. Katie, how about you?
Yeah, so, I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but, I think every business had learned a lot of things during coronavirus. And I think some of the processes or protocols that we put in place as a company were very much done very quickly. And I think now that things have maybe settled down a bit, it's a good time to reflect on what worked well and what work didn't, and really do that internal planning with your company or with your organization to see, what are the triggers for next time? Would we do the same, what would we do the same things, or what could be improved upon? I think using that to get a better sense of where the organization or company is with reacting to the next disaster, whether it's a hurricane or whether it's, a storm or the next wave of coronavirus, really helps to increase awareness within the organization internally between colleagues, and then also, knowing what the gaps are for potential use. I know that, so we have a small working group, just as an example. We have a small working group at the company, and then we're meeting every 2 weeks right now to make sure that we're monitoring all of our KPIs, that there aren't any outstanding issues for the next wave. So I think, being able to keep a pulse on those threats that are within your organization will allow people to mobilize really quickly if needed.
Great, Katie. Thank you so much. And Pat, last but not least.
You're not the first person ever said that to me. No, I would think that looking at your supply chain, I think every man-made or natural disaster or whatever you want to call what COVID is, our supply chain's critical where we get our resources from. And I think that we found a big disconnect in that, especially with COVID, since it's ongoing. We always think about things being short-term, but this will probably take who knows how long. So I think really having that relationship and a good fortified supply chain for your place of business and for your employees is very, very important to maintain and still be productive.
All right. I think that's also excellent advice. You heard it from Molly Doherty, Katie Murphy, Pat Shull, and Jeff Thomas. And here's the 4 bits that I wrote down. Know your hazards and risks. Build relationships during blue sky days. Do your internal planning and make corrective action, and understand your supply chain. So I'd like to thank our panelists for that very important information, as well as your time on the webinar today. And I'd like to, before we go to Q&A, pass it back to Tom Moran. Tom?
Thank you, Laura. I want to thank our panelists and all of you that attended today. I think I just encourage you to register with us. Why? The SICE provides the place to do all that, in a sense. Why is that important? Because the private sector needs that framework that they control, that protects everybody legally against all this stuff that happens when people share information. And it's just a marvelous effort, and it's much bigger than any of us. This is really wonderful. So I encourage you to do that. And for those of you that would like to get deeper into this, I invite you to, if you're interested, to become a member of the AHC. You can hit our website there. This provides access to a lot of the use cases, a lot of the recordings we have here. It's $27 a year. It's not a huge cost, but it provides our members, if you will, ways to, to work with multiple states, to work multiple use cases at once. It's just a great opportunity to do it. So I want to thank our presenters again. As we go through this, I'm sitting here smiling, Jeff, and for Pat, Katie, we're just scratching the surface, right? There's a lot more that could be done here, but that's for another time and place. So, Laura, thank you. We can go into some of our questions now and have a discussion around that. Thank you.
Yeah. So this is an old slide. This is back when I first started using Zoom. I think most of you know how to submit a question, but if you don't, just go ahead and type it in either the chat room or Q&A, and let us know if it's for a particular panelist today. And we have a few minutes to take some questions. So, and I also wanted to, while you guys are typing that in, let you know that we will have a conversation probably at the very end of the month or the beginning of October on State Business Emergency Operations Center programs and what they've learned since COVID-19. So you're on our marketing list. We'll be sure to send you that as well as other future programs coming up. So I did see one question here. If you, Molly or Jeff, if you interact with COADs and VOADs. Molly, you want to take that one?
So,
oh, Jeff, sorry. Go ahead, Jeff.
no, either one is fine. So that is part of Molly's Blue Sky Day job also, is dealing with the VOADs. But let me tell you kind of the intersection of that. So Molly, being external affairs, does work with our voluntary organizations at the state and county level, which I have to tell you in Pennsylvania are just fantastic. And sometimes they integrate with private sector all the time, because a lot of the companies and a lot of the volunteers are construction companies and those type of things. So, you know, I'm going to take a second to pitch a program that we started called PA Valor. So Valor was a program, voluntary organizations leading something or other. I'll let Molly get the right acronym. But the idea, FEMA started it in Puerto Rico. They were pumping money into VOADs. So VOADs bring to the table sometimes labor from private sector, a lot of private sector donations, and private sector just phenomenal at helping during disasters. They bring a lot of that, and they bring the volunteer groups together. A lot of times what they lack is money, because they don't have cash. They have people and they have things. So Pennsylvania, we have a lot of disasters that do not reach the level of a federal disaster declaration. We talk about all those small in geographic area, but devastating to people. So one of the things we did was work with the VOADs and the COADs, and they brought in their private sector partners, their businesses community, and we were able to get a certain bit of money put up by the governor's budget office to infuse those VOADs for certain projects for people that had no place else to go. They had to bring the labor to the table and the volunteers to the table. And again, that's done through a lot of private businesses. We put the cash in, and we were able to take that money and make it stretch about somewhere in the neighborhood of $7 to $8 for every dollar we put in it. We got back in value to that homeowner or that business. So, yep, we work with them all the time. Molly works with them, and I'm going to let Molly talk about if that is actually, some of them are Endeavor members, but I don't think Endeavor itself works with the VOADs and COADs directly. I think that they work through Molly, but it won't be the first time I'm wrong. So Molly, if I am, just be very, you're welcome to tell them.
No, I think you're absolutely right. You know, when Endeavor works together on operational issues, we haven't typically had also our voluntary organizations active in a disaster. However, something that we do to integrate the two is our Pennsylvania VOAD. They are on our distribution list, so they will receive all of the information that we're sending to our private sector partners. And there's a critical piece in coordinating private sector, profit and nonprofit, and that's that the Endeavor structure is not designed to buy and sell things. We have very strict procurement laws, as well as our ethics code, and we won't be in a position of ever saying to a business, hey, do you have anything you want to donate to Pennsylvania? That's not what we would do anyway. That's not the nature of the relationship. But we have had a number of times where we're able to improve really the ability for a community to respond and recover by connecting members of Pennsylvania VOAD with members of PA Endeavor. And a terrific example of that is flooding that we had a couple of years ago. Jeff had described that earlier. We had just a heinous amount of rain in 2 hours. And there were communities that were completely flooded. The volunteer organizations do what they do. They go out and they help those homes dry out and clean up. And there was one particular community, they did a fantastic job. They had dehumidifiers and they were drying out, I think 15 to 20 homes, only to find that 2 weeks later, the town was completely flooded again, and every one of those homes was damaged or destroyed. And in talking with Pennsylvania VOED, I know we have a number of partners that are able to provide resources. Pennsylvania VOED was ready to buy additional dehumidifiers, and then we were able to connect the two together. And they worked with one of our partners and said, we want to buy 30 dehumidifiers. And the equipment supply company said, great, we're going to give you 30 in addition to that. And what that means is that Pennsylvania VOED was able, now maintains a cache of 60 dehumidifiers, which they use throughout the entire state, both in urban and rural areas. And that's how we're able to kind of make the connections between the profit world and the nonprofit world down to the local level to really improve the resiliency of our communities.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Molly. I wanted to give everyone my email address in case you had any questions or wanted to get in touch with the panelists. So you'll see that on your screen, laura.johnson@ahcusa.org. We did have another question if we would make the slides available, and we're happy to, so we'll send that to you along with the recording. And I went ahead and promoted everyone to panelists who's left on the line. So we do have a few more minutes before we adjourn. So if anyone wants to unmute themselves and ask a verbal question or just introduce themselves and tell us a little bit more about what you do, that'd be great. Don't be shy.
Good afternoon. How are you?
Hi, Carolyn.
Hi, I'm Carolyn Bloom. I have Certain Ministries, which is community or Christian emergency readiness training. And one of the things that we have done and try to do is to develop local communities, local churches, to develop their response to the disaster to the community that they live in. We don't want them to all be shelters, and we don't want them all be food distribution. Some of them can do other types of work and try to bring one church into another church in order to build their volunteer base. And so along with a whole lot of other things that we do, we also teach the CERT program from the federal government and try to educate the church to be able to build their own teams of response within their community. Sometimes it's very favorable that I'm doing this, and other times it's not, depending on who you're talking to. But where the expertise comes from is I spent many years with the City and County of Denver Office of Emergency Management, and I was the only dedicated outreach and education and training person basically in the state of Colorado. So my audience was 1 million people and a day. And one of the things that we have to remember is that it's not, like Molly said, it's not all on the top. It's the people down on the bottom who we need to make sure that we service in order to get there. But we have to train them and try to push them in the direction of trying to become more resilient. And because what I'm looking at is we're going to lose 40% of our churches here during this pandemic because they're unable to be able to fund themselves out of it. Some of the larger churches are doing very well. Others are not doing very well at all. And they are closing their doors, unfortunately. And so that's where I try to look at the grassroots, and that's why the questions of what are you doing for the rural? If you're having these meetings and there's only 15 to 25 people in attendance, and y'all are working very diligently in order to try to get things done for Pennsylvania. If you don't bring in more masses from the bottom up, there's going to be, it just doesn't do a lot of impact on the local level. So those are my comments.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Carolyn, you're in Florida, correct?
Yes, I've relocated to Florida.
All right, because the issue, Florida does an amazing job with engagement at the local level, and the work that the churches are doing in engaging the churches with the local volunteer groups is it's really a reflective of a challenge that a number of nonprofits have, which is with the number of events that are happening, the rather larger organizations, your Salvation Armies, your Red Crosses, Southern Baptist Disaster Resource, those are all very active groups, and communities rely on those groups. But with the number of disasters that we've had, they're not able to be at every one. And so what you have going on in Texas right now, that means we have nobody in Pennsylvania that's working on some of the flooding, which
Right.
means you really have to shift engagement to the local level. And it's one of the reasons why engagement with not just nonprofit, but also the private sector, the profit part of the private sector is so important, because we can't fix it at the state level, and resources can be very limited at the local level. So being able to try to engage that whole community of both your volunteer as well as your profit organizations, it's exceptionally important.
Yes, I totally agree with that. And what I have been trying to explain to nonprofits across and the faith-based across the United States is I've been trying to explain to them that there's fires going on in the West, there's floods going on in the South, there's hurricanes hitting us, there's the virus is hitting everyone, and we do not have government and the private sector, profit-making sector, does not have the resources that we need in the United States to service all of the things that are going on. And that's one of my messages that I push out to the churches and the community, is that you need to start standing on your feet a little bit stronger. And what we've done with 911, we have done amazing marketing capability pushed into the United States, that you pick up the phone and call 911, we're coming. And it's like, don't plan on it, guys. If we have all these different things going on, you need to be able to be self-sustained for a while. And so as a nonprofit, that's what our mission is to try to develop more resiliency as we move through and talk with people. So
Thank you, Carolyn. We appreciate that so much. Okay, anybody else? Last minute question for our panelists? Okay. I think that would be it. So again, thank you so much to Molly, Katie, Pat, and I think Jeff dropped off. I don't see him on the one of the attendees, but he's a very busy person. Just want to say, stay safe. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. We hope you found it helpful, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one. Thank you, guys.
Thanks for having us. Thanks, Molly. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Laura.
Thanks.
Bye, Pat. See you guys later.